So anyways, if you would turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 5, I'm going to start by reading the first four verses. And it starts out like this. Balshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Balshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine in praise of the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So I'm going to stop there after verse 4, and we're going to make a few observations here. Now, the first one you're probably thinking is, who is this Balshazzar character, right? For the previous 4 lessons, we've learned about King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, all of a sudden, with no warning, we're talking about Balshazzar. Now, Balshazzar, the first thing you need to know, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? You know, I was getting to like Nebuchadnezzar. You know, he was this evil king starting out in chapter 1. And by chapter 4, he was given praise to the Almighty God of Israel. We don't know if Nebuchadnezzar eventually came to adopt the God of Israel as his own personal God. And maybe we'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven someday. Who knows? But this story in chapter 5 takes place 66 years later than chapter 1. So a lot of time has elapsed in chapter 5 compared to chapter 1 when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and took all those people back to Babylon, including Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children when they were only just teenagers, 16, 17, 18 years old. So this story takes place 66 years after the events of chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar died after a 43-year reign. He was about 80 years old when he passed. And his son, you've got to hear this, just like with any monarch, there's all kinds of drama, right, when it comes to passing the gavel to someone new. And his son Merodach ruled for 2 years, but was assassinated by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. Neriglissar assumed the throne and ruled for 4 years and died of natural causes. Neriglissar's son, I'm going to try and pronounce this, Laborasorachad, only a child, 10 or 11 years old. He was a child king, and he had diminished mental capacities, ruled for only 9 months because a mob, a gang of conspirators, beat him to death. Poor kid. And his conspirators appointed a man by the name of Nabonidus to be the next king of Babylon. Nabonidus was actually a relative of Nebuchadnezzar's, like a son-in-law on the wife's side. And Nabonidus becomes the next king of Babylon. So for hundreds of years, this is really interesting. For hundreds of years, Nabonidus was believed the last king of Babylon. If you read history books or anything like that, it talks about Nabonidus being the last king before Babylon was conquered. But our story tonight talks about Belshazzar being the last king. So is there a contradiction? Critics of the Bible have said for centuries, this is a contradiction. This proves that the Bible is not true. However, in 1881, they found something called the clay cylinders of Nabonidus. And I got a picture if you want to throw that up there. There we go. This is how people wrote, I guess, back in Babylonian days. They took a clay cylinder and wrote stuff on it and formed. They had a collection of these cylinders that were found in the city of Ur, which is modern-day Iraq, and they were called the Nabonidus cylinders. And on these cylinders, when you read about it, Nabonidus explains how he moved his headquarters to Arabia because he was trying to work deals with the Medes and the Persians who were on the rise at this particular time, trying to open trade routes, may have even been out at war. Nabonidus was one of those kings that went to war with his men. So he left his son. This cylinder even says he left his son, Balshazzar, back in Babylon as sort of a co-regency. In other words, two kings ruling at the same time. Nabonidus off afar, and Balshazzar back home in Babylon ruling the kingdom. I just thought that was amazing. For centuries, people thought there was a contradiction in the Bible. But then they find these Nabonidus cylinders that proves that the Bible was correct. Belshazzar was in charge when Babylon went down. So, my answer now, when people say, well, there's nothing archaeological that proves the Bible, I would say, keep on looking. You just haven't found it yet. I'm sure the proof is there. You just haven't found it. Now, interesting thing about those first 4 scriptures I read, you notice there's a party going on, right? At this particular moment, King Belshazzar is holding a grand party. And he's holding this party while an army of Persians and Medes are assembled around the entire city of Babylon. Now, if you were the king of Babylon, and there was an entire army outside the gates of Babylon, en masse, in formations, all the way around your kingdom, would you be holding a party? Would you be having a drunken, debauched party at that particular time? So the question is, what would you do if a great army was amassed around your city? You'd throw the best party ever, right? This is what Belshazzar is doing. He had over 1,000 people present for this party. Babylon's most important people were there. The best music was playing. The most beautiful women. The wine was flowing. It was a great party. Now, why would Belshazzar have a party when his city is surrounded by the enemy? Well, there's 2 possible reasons for this. He may have been overconfident. If you do some research on the city of Babylon, it says that the walls that surrounded the city of Babylon were 17 miles. 17 miles of wall that went all the way around the circumference of Babylon. The walls were 22 feet thick, 90 foot high. It's said that 3 chariots could ride side by side along the top of the wall all the way around the city. The gates were made of bronze, not wood. A lot of old palaces and castles had these big wooden doors, that would crank open and crank down. The gates of Babylon were made out of bronze. Have you ever held something made out of bronze? I had a bronze plaque made for a pavilion we have at work that's dedicated to veterans. And this thing was probably, 2.5 feet wide by 2.5 feet. It was like a square like this. And when I pulled that thing out of the van, it was like, lugging this thing. It was heavy. Bronze is heavy. These gates were made of bronze. And there were several gates located around the city walls of Babylon. And an interesting thing about Babylon was the Euphrates River ran right through the center of it. So these walls were actually built atop the river on both sides of the city. And they had these huge bronze gates that would come down. Now, of course, they were, poled gates, so the water could get through them. But they went deep into the Euphrates. And so you couldn't even swim into the Euphrates. You had to still get through those bars if you were in the Euphrates River. So inside, in addition to these bronze gates, inside the walls, there was an elaborate system of inner walls and moats. So it's very easy to understand why maybe Belshazzar was a little confident. He didn't care that the entire Persian and Mede army was outside his gates. He was going to party. He had that much confidence in the defenses of Babylon that he didn't think there was any way they were going to get in. In fact, it is said that Babylon was so well fortified that they had enough food inside the city of Babylon. They had a fresh supply of fresh water running through the Euphrates River that they could live for 20 years under siege because they had that much animals and food and stuff inside the gates. So it doesn't sound like Belshazzar was too worried about the Medes and the Persians outside his gate. Or possibly he was using his big party as a distraction. Maybe he was well aware that the enemy was en masse outside of the gates, and he was using this party to just put it out of his mind. And you know what? That's not very uncommon for what we do today. How do we, when human behavior, when we're facing something that we don't want to deal with, the possible death of a family member. You don't want to think about that. Or maybe your marriage is on the rocks and you don't want to think about that. So what do? You distract yourself with something else. And unfortunately, the world uses things like drugs and parties and romance and excitement to distract them from the real problem. Anything to keep us from dealing with the situation at hand. So in addition to this grand party, Balshazzar adds something else that was very bad on top of this. It's not bad enough that his city is surrounded by the enemy. He's having this great party, but he also adds sacrilege to it. He calls for the holy vessels from the temple of Jerusalem that Solomon built. And Nebuchadnezzar had taken all that stuff. When he raided Jerusalem, conquered Jerusalem, he took all that valuable stuff out of the temple and brought it back to Babylon, and they put it in their storehouses of their gods. Now that was bad enough, but Nebuchadnezzar never touched that stuff. He just left it in storage. Belshazzar says, go bring that stuff here. We're going to party with these golden plates and silver platters and goblets. So maybe he thought, this is something that his predecessors had never done. Touch that valuable stuff from the temple in Jerusalem. Maybe he thought it would boost morale. If everyone's drinking out of the cups of the God of Israel, it'll remind them that, hey, yeah, sure, the Medes and the Persians are outside our gate, but we conquered the God of Israel, so the Medes and Persians are nothing. Just drink up. Let's have a great time. The golden cups, the platters from the temple are being used to serve hors d'oeuvres. Kelly used to make fun of me because I would call hors d'oeuvres hors d'oeuvres, because that's what it looks like when you spell it. And the golden cups and the goblets are being used. Belshazzar and his guests are guzzling wine from the golden cups from the temple. It's complete disrespect for the God of Israel. And to make matters worse, they are using these holy articles to praise and worship the gods of the gold and silver and brass and iron and wood and stone. So this is a bad thing that Belshazzar is doing right now. And verse 5 picks up, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. So that's a very academic way of saying that Belshazzar was scared out of his mind. He could hardly stand up. His knees were shaken. You would be too if you saw this mysterious hand out of nowhere start writing something on the wall. Now imagine if you were at this grand party, music's playing, girls are dancing, wine's flowing, everybody's having a good time, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this hand appears and starts writing on the wall. Now, the Bible doesn't say it, but in my imagination, I want to think of this as a very large hand. I mean, if you got 1,000 people in this huge banquet room, and this hand the size of my hand starts writing on the wall, how many people would even notice that? And back then, they probably lit the place with candles and not lights like we have today. So, I don't know, in my mind, even though the Bible doesn't say it, I'm thinking this might have been some very huge hand. Maybe the size of a human being, this huge hand writing on the wall, and everything just stops. You might have heard a wine glass hit the ground and shatter, or people were, they can't believe what they're seeing. This big hand is writing something on the wall. The music grinds to a halt. Wine glasses probably hit the floor. Belshazzar's countenance changes. His knees are knocking together, sort of like Shaggy on Scooby-Doo. You ever watch that, Johnny? He's terrified at what he sees. The writing is on the wall for Belshazzar. Now, by the way, you've heard that term, the writing's on the wall. That's where we get this, from the book of Daniel. A lot of the phrases we use in our modern day life come right from the Bible. The handwriting was on the wall for Belshazzar. Folks, we don't want to wait until the writing is on the wall for us. We've got the writing in our Bibles to cling to now, to guide us, to show us what we should do, how we should act, how we should behave, what we should say, what we should do. We got something better than handwriting on the wall. We got the writing of the Bible. We got God's word. Verse 7 says, the king cried aloud to bring in his astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, isn't it funny how all these kings, they do the same thing? When something happens, some kind of mysterious thing, what do? They call for their soothsayers and their wizards and their Chaldeans, and they call for those people first. And it's interesting, here's another confirmation for what the Bible knew all along, but it took archaeologists until the late 1800s to figure out. Notice how Balshazzar says that anyone who can interpret what these words mean, he'll clothe them in scarlet, he'll have a chain of gold about their neck, and he'll make them the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, why the third ruler? Why not the second? Well, if his father Nebuchadnezzar was the true king, and Belshazzar, his son, was the second king, well, then the next position he had to offer was the third position in the kingdom. So there's more proof that God's word is correct, and it just takes archaeologists a lot of time to catch up with the truth. So, verse 8 says, Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now, the Bible uses that word astonied. That means astonished. So it's curious that nobody could figure this out. You would think that all his school-trained astrologers and Chaldeans and soothsayers would be, even if this was written in Hebrew language, you would have thought that somebody would have known the Hebrew language and would have been able to read these words on the wall and interpret that. But it says they couldn't read it. So it could have been a Daniel 4 situation. Remember in chapter 4, his wise men did know what it said, but they didn't have the courage to tell King Nebuchadnezzar what it meant. So Daniel had to come in and tell him. Maybe it was that situation, but probably not, because verse 8 says they couldn't read it. Perhaps it was written in Hebrew and the Chaldeans could read it, but not understand its meaning or significance or how it applied to the situation. So in verse 10, I found this interesting. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in the kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom King Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. You remember when Daniel interpreted that dream, the king Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed, he said, Daniel, you're in charge of all my wise men. Now remember, Daniel's not a young man anymore. Verse 12 says, For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will show thee the interpretation. This queen kind of knew her stuff. Now, this wasn't Belshazzar's queen, because we learned in the first scripture that I read that Belshazzar and all his wives and his concubines were in this party. So this queen comes in after the fact. This was probably the queen's mother, or maybe it was Nebuchadnezzar's widow. Probably not. She would have been very old. Maybe it was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter-in-law. But this Belshazzar would have been Nebuchadnezzar's great-grandson, okay, on his mother's side. So he wasn't even truly down the line. But this queen mother comes in. She remembers Daniel and all the great things he did, how Nebuchadnezzar promoted him to be above all the wise people. And she tells King Belshazzar, you need to call Daniel. Now, this queen, she's a grandmother, possibly Nebuchadnezzar's widow. The Bible doesn't say. She has class. She has wisdom. Too much dignity to be taking part in this debauchery party that's going on. And she says, Belshazzar, your father had a man. And now when she says your father, she doesn't mean your biological father. A lot of Jews say that Abraham is our father, right? many times removed. So yes, Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's father, many times removed. But in royal lineage, he was a descendant, not biologically. He was probably a grandson by marriage, but the queen refers to him as his father. Your father had a man who could decipher these things. He had wisdom. He had the holy gods within him. Again, the Babylonians were polytheistic. They always say you have the wisdom of the holy gods. Really, Daniel had the wisdom of the one true God of Israel in him. You need to call for him. She even refers to him by his Hebrew name. She says, call Daniel. She doesn't call him Belteshazzar like Nebuchadnezzar called him. She had respect for him. She knew of him. So in verse 13, we learn Daniel comes into the room. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king that my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. So finally, we bring in Daniel. After we've already used up all the other options we have, we call for Daniel. When everything's great, that's human nature. When everything's great, the party's going strong, the wine is flowing, the women are beautiful, who cares about Daniel? But when the writing is on the wall, when the situation is dire, when the finances are shaky, when the diagnosis is dire, when there's infidelity in your relationship, then all of a sudden, we want to know what the man of God has to say. They call for Daniel. Now, it doesn't have to be this way. You can give God your attention right now. You don't have to wait until something horrible happens in your life to call for the man of God. This is why we pray. This is why we read daily. This is why your service, your dedication to God should be something that is daily. Daily. We wouldn't go a day without eating, right? Unless we were fasting. Come noon, we'd remind ourselves, boy, I didn't eat breakfast this morning. I got to find something to eat. But how many days on end will we go without praying or reading the Bible? That's our food. That is our spiritual food. So Belshazzar keeps telling Daniel that he has heard of him. Did you notice he repeated that several times? I've heard of thee, Daniel. And he's repeating what the queen told him. I don't think Belshazzar really had a relationship with Daniel at all. He heard what the queen said, that sounds pretty good. And when Daniel comes in, I've heard of you. You're the one with all the knowledge, right? You're the one who my father put over top of all the wise men. He's repeating himself. He seems nervous. In verse 16, he says, and again, and I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar is offering Daniel all the good things that he can offer him as the king. He's trying to remain calm. He wants Daniel to know he's still in control, but he's nervous about what he's about to hear. And he wants Daniel to know he's still the king, he's still in charge. And I have gifts and rewards to give you if you can show me what the interpretation of these words are. Perhaps I can hire you as a consultant, Daniel. So Daniel, again, he's probably retired by now. We're talking Daniel must be 80 years old. He was brought to Babylon when he was 16, 17, 18 years old. This particular story takes place 66 years later, so do the math. Daniel's in his 80s now. He's probably got long, silver, hairy, maybe he's bald, who knows. But verse 17 says, Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. You got to like how Daniel approaches this. He's not the young guy anymore that's worried about pleasing the king. He's got some age and wisdom on him now, and he just tells the king like it is. He's like, keep your gifts, your rewards. They mean nothing anyways, since this kingdom is about to fall. Not only that, Daniel didn't need the king's riches and honors. He served the God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and the wealth on every mine. So there's nothing that Belshazzar can offer him that his Lord and Savior can't already give him. Daniel's faith and trust was in the God of Israel. We should all strive to be like Daniel. In verse 18, Daniel says, O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. Whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up. And whom he would, he put down. But then his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride. He was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of the heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. So Daniel ends up giving Belshazzar a little history lesson about Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar, which Belshazzar should have already known. Notice the tone Daniel takes with Belshazzar. It's not, remember when Daniel used to speak with Nebuchadnezzar, he actually felt bad giving him bad news. He says, "Oh, king, live forever. If only this were for your enemies." But it's not, it's for you, and it pains me to have to tell you this. But he doesn't take that approach with Belshazzar. He says, he doesn't say, "Oh, king, live forever." He doesn't feel bad to deliver the news to him. He's very direct with Belshazzar. Something tells me Daniel did not have the same level of respect for Belshazzar that he had for Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel proceeds to give Belshazzar a history lesson about his own kingdom, how great Nebuchadnezzar was when he gave the Most High God glory. But when he was lifted up in his pride, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He fell. He had that 7 years of insanity where he felt like he was a cow and he was eating grass. Belshazzar, you would have thought, would have known about this. A true king would know the history of his kingdom and had learned of the prior mistakes made by his predecessors and tried not to repeat them. So he goes on to tell Belshazzar that he will suffer a terrible fate for his actions in total disregard for the one true God. In verse 22, and he says, "And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knowest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, which hear not, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified." He's pretty much scolding Belshazzar. You know, I actually got excited when I read verse 23 because it went right in line with what I preached on Sunday. Remember I said when God breathed life into Adam, he breathed life into his nostrils. He gave us a soul. And whether a man wants to admit it or not, there is something deep in the soul of every man that desires to know their Maker, to cry out to their Maker. And Daniel tells Belshazzar here, the God in whose hand thy breath is. God gave you that breath, Belshazzar, and he could take it from you at any moment. And you have spit on this God. You have not glorified this mighty God. You know, Daniel says, keep your gifts, keep your rewards, give them to another. I'll gladly help out and explain this message, however. So in verse 24, he says, "Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written." He lets him know it's God that wrote this. This hand you see, that's the hand of God, writing on the wall for you. Verse 25, "And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin." This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. And notice he said that twice. Mene, Mene. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now Daniel first lets Belshazzar know that this was the hand of God that wrote these words. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. If you just interpret it by the word, it means numbered, weighed, divided. Maybe the Chaldeans could have read that. numbered, weighed, divided. But they probably had no idea what that meant. It took Daniel being told by God what the prophecy was, what the meaning of those 4 words were, to give to Belshazzar. And he goes on to interpret the message for Belshazzar. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. He repeated it twice, meaning God has numbered him twice, and even so, he's come up short both times. Tekel, God has weighed you in the balance, and you do not measure up, Belshazzar. Upharsin, your kingdom will be divided. Now, Perez and Upharsin are actually the same word in Hebrew. Upharsin is a plural part of, Perez is the singular. I kind of learned that today through some, because I wondered why, if it said Upharsin, would he say Perez? Means the same thing. Your kingdom will be divided between the Medes and the Persians. You know, one day God is going to weigh us in the balance, just like he did Belshazzar. And are we going to measure up? Are we going to have the correct number? Are we going to be found wanting? I do not want to be found wanting when God measures me, when God weighs me in the balance. I want to make sure I'm ready to meet the Lord. And I know there are so many things on this earth, so many things in this world that are tempting, that draw us to them. And I've fell prey to many of those things during my life. And I'm glad that God has tarried with me to the ripe age of 52, and I hope he tarries with me for the next 20, 30 years, or however many years he gives me of life. But I just want to keep growing in God, and I learn more and more the older I get. None of that stuff the world has to offer means a thing. What means a thing is our walk with the Lord. Do we measure up? Does God number us correctly? Do we measure up? Are we going to found? I do not want to be found wanting. So in verse 29, it says, Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Now, Daniel said he didn't want all that, but Belshazzar did it anyways. And it probably didn't mean much. Belshazzar did not deny Daniel's interpretation. He could have said, I don't like that interpretation, off with his head. No, he awards Daniel for the interpretation. And he goes on to give Daniel these rewards, but it didn't really matter much. The kingdom lasted maybe 2 more hours after this event. Verse 30 says, In that night was Belshazzar, the king of Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. In other words, 62 years old was Darius the Mede when he conquered Babylon. Now you're probably thinking, how in the world did Darius conquer Babylon after I just explained to you how well fortified Babylon was? Well, history says that the Medes and the Persians attacked at a time when the Euphrates River was at its lowest. It was during the dry season. Now, it was still, even though it was low, it wasn't so low that they could just walk right in. But several miles upstream, where they couldn't be viewed, they dug trenches and they dug several trenches, and they diverted a lot of the river water away from the main river, which lowered the river even more. And they were able to lower the river to about knee-high. And they were able to dig underneath those bronze gates during the night and get inside the walls of Babylon. And when they got in there, they found a bunch of drunken partiers. And they pretty much took the city without a fight. So Darius the Mede was 62 years old when he conquered Babylon. Now you might think, okay, what's this story have to do with me? Well, you know, when the Bible talks about Babylon, there's physical Babylon that we read about in this story, a city that existed thousands of years ago, and now only archaeologists can dig up and find remnants of it. But the Bible also talks about a spiritual Babylon. And do you realize that the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah both prophesied about the fall of Babylon almost to the T? They talked about the Persians being able to pretty much walk in without a fight. And that's exactly what happened. They talked about a river, Euphrates, and they pretty much predicted this 150 years before it even happened. And in the time of physical Babylon. Babylon was partying. They had no fear. They were drinking. They were just living it up. And that's how it's going to be in spiritual Babylon. That's kind of like how it is today. There's no fear. There's a rejection of the Bible. There's a rejection of God's ways. We are experiencing spiritual Babylon today. And just like physical Babylon was conquered, spiritual Babylon will be conquered someday as well. And I don't want to be one of those people that's in a drunken state, not understanding what's going on right underneath my nose. We want to be always looking for the coming of Jesus and be prepared for it. So that's pretty much the main lesson tonight in chapter 5. And you'll also learn when we get to chapter 6 that Darius doesn't remain the king for very long. He rules for about 3 years, and then he dies, and a gentleman by the name of Cyrus takes over, King Cyrus, who was also prophesied about in the book of Isaiah. There's a lot of good stuff.